I think just to respond to the question around National Treasury involvement, yes, I think Chuma in his presentation yesterday alluded to the fact that National Treasury are closely working on this. I think he mentioned that there is a published document around sustainability. So Commissioner wrote to the DG of Treasury in this regard. So there is that collaboration between us and Treasury. Yeah. Okay, so in terms of this session, it's not meant to be prescriptive. I think it's meant to have all of us inform the next steps, basically. And I just prepared a few slides, not necessarily with content that comes from academia or anything, but really informed by the fact that all of us participating here will also be informing the next steps, right? So the session is meant to try and get all of us to agree on who will form part of the working groups in taking this process forward, but also what are the key considerations that those working groups should really look at in terms of the agenda going forward. I mentioned earlier that the momentum needs to be kept going so that we don't lose, we don't have a gap between where we are and where we should be in terms of the ISSB program. So in the next slide, effectively, what I put together is just a list of attendees that we have for this session, but I would need to be guided by yourselves because the working groups would obviously have different strengths. I think Mihal already mentioned that there would be a technical committee or subcommittee, so which means there would need to be the driving committee, which will have subcommittees underneath, so that eventually the work that is done by the subcommittees can inform the main working group. So I did not try and nominate persons into those committees, but please feel free to also guide and in terms of what are the key considerations for those working groups. Ideally, regulators, industry would have to really inform the agenda of those working groups, and all of us represented here are committed to this process. But we also know that there are best practices that if a working group is too large, it's likely to move very slowly. You would want a lean working group which can have specific achievables that if they focus on and make sure that the agenda is carried through. So in terms of the list of all of us represented, we have DTIC policy and DTIC industrial financing. I think Susan yesterday was anchoring a panel. CIPC naturally would want to be part of this, FSCA, JSE. But I want to really open it up in terms of guidance on this specific activity. What are the thoughts around this? Okay. Thank you. There's an input coming through. Things from
Thank you. Just a suggestion following on from my earlier comment about educating and sensitizing and soft landing this initiative. I would like to see more of the private corporate sector involved here, if possible. At the moment, it just seems like a lot of bodies and regulators, and I think it would be short-sighted not to include more of the business and the corporates in here, because I think ultimately at the end of the day, they're going to have to buy into this thing if it's going to get traction, and that obviously flows through to the investors as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So in terms of I think the next slide does refer to all corporates present in this session. And so we try to have everyone named and listed on the sort of list of persons that can be part of the working group. But we did not want to prescribe in terms of the number as such. Okay, so this being the case, I just want to inquire with Tanya. I'm just going to put you on the spot. I know there's a lot of thinking that went behind this kind of setup. Chuma indeed also saw it in the same way in terms of us having an anchor team which will help drive this going forward. Are you able to maybe shed some light in terms of your thinking on having that key team?
Thank you very much, Jay. So I think you've listed, importantly, a lot of parties that have been participating the last 2 days.
Yes.
Some of the names I note are people who were going to hopefully participate and didn't necessarily, so I think we just need to be mindful of that. And I would suggest as well that we need to be mindful to reach out to the people as well. Absolutely, they're interested in the topic, but we just need to be mindful to force them into sort of continuing in working groups. So that would be sort of my first caution. I think that the first starting point really is to make sure, and you refer to sort of a steering group, is really to have a focus there, and for that group to then determine the various steps. So to me, there's probably 3 sort of key questions to be asked. The first is, what is the objective? And the question is making sure we pull in the right people for that objective of the disclosure. The next would be what sort of standards, which standards, adopted standards or adapted standards, and then interlinked with that is who it should apply to. We've spoken about PI scores, and I think there's quite a lot of work in my mind that has to be done in that. So those are sort of 3 key themes that I think need to flow through. And I think that sort of a steering group would assist in then forming working groups. What's not clear, and I think Chuma and I were focusing a lot on getting this session together and getting the people at this sort of function and venue. I think what's very important is to look at the end game. I know that SIPSI and through DTI there is some looming November date. I'm not too sure what the intention or the request for that date is. Is that just a step in the process, or is that an end game? In which case I'd suggest it's a very short time period. But I think one needs to sort of set what is the roadmap, what are the objectives, and work back from there. And you'll know from a JSE perspective that we have highlighted really that there are a lot of areas that we can do well to do research in. And then the research does not necessarily have to be done by a working group, but rather that it could be managed by parties. So I think those are some key decisions that have to be taken. And I know yesterday when I spoke briefly to Chuma about this, he was suggesting there might be a link that could be sent out and people could put their hands up and say, yes, we would be interested in getting involved in a future working group.
Thanks very much. I think that really helps in shedding light on what to do, because CIPC did not necessarily want to come across as sort of imposing and forcing people to participate in these working groups. I think the work that will be done post the session will certainly be the one of sort of proposing the key group, but also hearing from other participants as to how far they would like to be involved. I know when I spoke to IRBA, Imre did mention that they certainly want to participate in the working group, but also I spoke to other delegates who also indicated that they want to participate in the working group. So there is already some interest which will help drive the momentum within that key group. Yeah. Thanks. So this will be an action that will be done post the session. Yeah. We can move to the next slide. And the next slide really touches on some of the considerations that were highlighted by attendees, and if effectively the agenda that will be looked at, we'll have to take into account the fact that more research has got to be done, definitely. And the commissioner this morning referred to the fact that there's a business case that has to be developed. Certainly it will be one of the outputs at some point. And I think you alluded to the issue of research in terms of funding. I spoke to Andre and yourself, Tanya, to say let's look at IFC sponsoring some of the work that can be done to ensure that we strengthen our case. The issue of education, capacitation of industry also becomes quite key. Andre also mentioned that we must make sure that SA remains on the map. So as much as we will be implementing ISSB standards, there will be some teething, there will be some challenges at some point, but ultimately it is SA that has to be on the map. And I think we heard also from Caroline earlier about the JEEP principle. So these are some of the considerations that the ultimate paper that will be developed by the working groups and all of us will need to inform and talk to, making sure that this is a SADC deal or AU deal, mandate the filing of the ISSB standards, but make sure that we have a balance. Learn from previous mandation, customize the standards, have an SA context to it, stagger the filing regime. There was a reference to the PIS score having to be a consideration. Have proper transitional provisions, especially a 12-month timeline where you can have voluntary for others and compulsory for others. Cater for different archetypes. I think Tanya in her presentation alluded to that for the beginners and those who are advanced. Have ethics of ESG, Imre touched on that. So there's about 3 slides on considerations that can be given by the working groups in taking this process forward. And essentially this input comes from all of us. So I think my job just became easier because then I will be converging to the team who put together the agenda, and we sort of reach out to everyone and make available some of these slides so that it can also inform some of the initial discussions which will be taking place. I don't think we will necessarily have hands being raised as to I want to be part of that, but at least this also says there's been some collation of input made, but that input will be meaningful in assisting us in taking the agenda forward. So the rest of the slides are essentially just capturing the high-level pointers which will help inform some of the work going forward. So I think, Program Director, that's what I thought we could just talk to on this item without necessarily expecting that the outcome of this item will be that we have a working group nominated or put together, but at least just to say there is an agenda that we'll be talking to in the work that we'll be doing. Thanks. Thank you. All right. No, thanks very much for your attention. We'll just be in touch in that regard here. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.